Well, welcome everybody, and thanks for joining us for this last panel of the day. We're gathered to discuss progress and challenges around reform of the global financial architecture. The Monterey Consensus, adopted under the auspices of the United Nations in 2002, had at its heart a commitment to improve voice and representation at the IMF and the World Bank, and within the global financial architecture. This was reiterated in the Pact for the Future, which was adopted by world leaders last month in New York. The topic is gaining momentum, and there's exciting new avenues for change. This is also about the reform process underway at the international financial institutions and the multilateral development banks to make them fit for today's world. That means being bigger and more effective and getting more money as well as more voice to developing countries to deliver impact. It's also about how to better leverage private finance and do so in a way that doesn't further exacerbate debt and inequality. So I'm joined today by 5 excellent panelists who I'd like to welcome to the stage. Please come join me. Thank you. So we have Junhua, United Nations Under-Secretary General for Economic and Social Affairs, Anneliese Dodds, UK Minister for International Development and Women and Equalities, Marc Flanagan, Deputy Director of the Strategy, Policy and Review Department at the IMF, Claudio Fernandes, economist at GESTOS, a health and human rights non-profit based in Brazil, and Sara Ahmed, Managing Director and Finance Advisor to the Vulnerable 20 Group of Developing Countries. Welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Good afternoon.
So, Under-Secretary General Lee, I'd like to start with you. The UN has been a strong proponent for financial reform in the post-pandemic period. Secretary General Antonio Guterres has called the system outdated, dysfunctional, and unjust. So, what does a just and fair international financial architecture look like to you? And more importantly, how do we get there from here?
Well, thank you, Natasha, for giving me the floor. Good afternoon to everyone. Just now, as you said, this is the last session for this afternoon. I hope it's not the most difficult and challenging issue before us. But let me start by thanking our host for giving and inviting UN to share our own perspective. As you rightly said it, our journey actually started more than 2 decades ago, but still it's an unmet aspiration. Well, to start with this, from UN's perspective, we need to acknowledge that we are in a development crisis or sustainable development crisis, together with the crisis on climate change and also the geopolitical tensions. But how we can address these challenges, most severe challenges facing the global south. And over the past 1.5 days, we heard a lot from the leaders, from ministers, from business sectors, from the academia, and also from civil society and the youth representatives. So from UN, we certainly believe that among all these challenges, the financing challenge are at the heart of this sustainable development crisis. Because we're witnessing the financing gap are growing, and also there's less resources to bridge the gap. Now, according to our latest estimate, annually, the sustainable development financing gap stands like the $4 trillion. And then also international financial architecture, I have to confess that up to now has failed to adequately protect the developing countries in this moment of the crisis. Then we will say, what would be the roadmap for us to address these challenges, as put it as a just and a fair, as you said, how we can get there. And the Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Guterres, has put forward his vision, his idea, his proposals in his policy brief issued last year. And let me just highlight the 3 key priorities for us in our preparation for the next year's the 4th International Conference on Financing for Development, after the Summit of the Future. First, we need to deliver a development-oriented debt architecture. We must address the intertwined debt and the development dilemma because too many developing countries are forced to cut their investment in the SDG because of the debt challenges. We are very encouraged to see that by recent efforts from the IMF, World Bank, and other financial institutions, together with the G20, the more forthcoming efforts and also synergies among the various stakeholders to address this compounding crisis. But I have to say that we need to act with a sense of the urgency. We need the mechanisms to better support the countries with the debt overhangs and the physical constraints. And we must deliver the faster and the deeper debt treatments for countries that need to restructure, building on the progress made on the common framework, domestic legislations, and other initiatives. Second, we need an effective financing architecture. Now we see that the SDG financing gap is increasing, and then what called by the Global South is to dramatically scale up the access to the affordable long-term financing. So in this regard, the UN Secretary General actually put forward his bold initiative, we call it the SDG stimulus package, which has been endorsed by the entire UN membership and also endorsed by G20 in the last New Delhi summit. Let me put it more concretely, what it needs to be done under this massive scale up.
Sorry, Lee, if we could just, to the third point.
Oh, yes. Just to require additional resources. Last but not least, we need a fairer global economic governance. As you said, it's just and fair. What is the just and fair to UN? If this mechanism can rescue and deliver the SDGs, it's just and fair. Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, I'd like to come back to some of the details on exactly how that's going to be executed shortly. But Marc, if we can turn to you. Lee alluded to the fact that the IMF leadership has been receptive to calls for reform. Could you tell us from your perspective about the key steps taken by the IMF to upgrade to meet today's challenges? Where that key progress has been made.
Well, thank you, Natasha. And again, thanks to the organizers for inviting me as well. So first, I want to recognize these challenges. They've been immense over the last 5 years. We've had a pandemic, a cost of living crisis, a major war in Europe. We've had growing impacts of climate change on the globe. We've had debt challenges, as Undersecretary Lee highlighted. And we've also had a growing concern about geoeconomic fragmentation. Now, the IMF has been doing quite a lot as part of the architecture to try to address these things and to shift the way we operate to more effectively address these things. So I want to highlight just a few. First is strengthening our role in the global financial safety net. So we've had the historic SDR allocation, $650 billion, $275 billion of which went to low-income and emerging markets. And if you look at the share of the smallest countries, relative to their GDP, they got twice as much as advanced economies. And we've also been working on rechanneling these SDRs to support our resilience and sustainability trust and to support our poverty reduction and growth facilities. So we've been doing a lot on strengthening our role in the safety net. On climate, we've done a lot to put this more at the center of IMF work. So we did introduce in 2022 the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, which allows us to lend a lot of money to lower income and developing and emerging market countries to help them address the cost of long-term challenges like climate. It's very important. On the debt resolution architecture, we've been very busy there too. The fund has been, first of all, I think people don't realize in the spring of this year, we introduced some major reforms to our own policies, which are going to speed up restructuring substantially. Now, fortunately, we haven't had a restructuring where we've had to test this out, and frankly, it's our job to try to prevent these in the first place, so maybe we'll get lucky and we never will have to. But if there are restructurings, which is likely, these will work to speed things up. Now, the other thing we've been doing, of course, is we've used our convening power to bring together global creditors in the context of the Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable to discuss how they can work together to improve their coordination processes. So the debt architecture, we've been working hard to try to make this work better. There's still a lot to be done, though, in that area, obviously. And the final thing I want to note here is, of course, in the area of geofragmentation, geoeconomic fragmentation, where we've been doing a lot to highlight to our membership the costs of competitive trade and industrial policies, and to try to support an open global trading system, which really is a fundamental building block for development. Now, last point on voice and representation. As you know, we've been working in that direction. We weren't able to realize anything in our recent quota review, but we're going to keep working in that direction. But I do want to mention, as Deputy Director of the Strategy, Policy and Review Department, the effort we make when we bring in policies to generate a wide consensus amongst our membership on the reforms we bring in. So the debt reforms this spring got full support of our membership, and we took the time to get that. So even though the formality of the voice may not be there, de facto the way we operate makes sure that these constituencies do get a voice as these policies are formulated that affect them. And of course, we'll continue that, and we hope to bring in more formality in this voice and quota as soon as we can, subject, of course, to the wishes of our membership. Thanks.
Thank you, Marc. So we've heard from the UN and we've heard from the IMF. Anneliese, you're representing the UK government within the group of 20 major economies. Please, could you tell us about some of the proposals at the G20 to enhance the group's leadership of global economic governance and what role the UK is playing, the new government in the UK, in advancing those?
Well, I'm really delighted to be part of this conversation. Thank you very much for inviting the UK to take part. And we're really determined to see faster systemic reform of the global financial architecture. And of course, the G20, as you say, has been working on this, and we recognise that there is a high degree of consensus across the G20 on some of the elements of what needs to change. So I'll try and tick through those elements quite quickly just now. Obviously, they're set out in the G20 Multilateral Development Bank roadmap, and it set out ways in which the international financial system can adapt so it becomes bigger, better, and more effective. First of all, to be better, the roadmap sets out an increase in accessibility and responsiveness from the MDBs. We think that needs stepping up the level of ambition on private capital mobilization. Of course, they're going with the grain of what a number of the MDBs are pushing forward themselves, scaling up local currency as well, and increasing concessional resources to low-income countries. Obviously, we've heard that message loud and clear from low-income countries. When it comes to being bigger, the G20 roadmap proposes that the MDBs need to increase financing so that they're addressing new and existing needs. And of course, we just had the scale of those set out a moment ago. I would say also, of course, the extent of conflict within countries and the legacy of that for future economic development also being important. But then, as I said, the roadmap also sets out measures for the architecture becoming more effective. So it proposes that MDBs should foster coordination and cooperation and increase MDBs' geographical representation and their representation of women as well, both when it comes to their management boards roles and amongst their staff too. So a big challenge there, but much that needs to change. Of course, Brazil has continued to push for these efforts under its G20 leadership. And we're already seeing a number of changes there, both around the capital adequacy framework, for example, and in other areas too. The UK does want to see more progress on this. We want to see the multilateral development banks taking on more risk, unlocking more lending, stretching those balance sheets further. We need to see more innovation as well, we would say, across the G20. The UK, for example, has been pushing guarantees. You will have seen this, securitization, and hybrid capital as well. Where they're appropriate, we need to be innovating so that we can unlock additional financing. And we also do need to be taking action on some of the issues that Under-Secretary Lee was talking about around debt, for example, making sure that isn't holding countries back. We're pushing for improvements to the common framework for quicker debt treatment for countries in debt distress, and also natural disaster debt clauses as well. But of course, technical changes aren't enough. We do need to have that change in representation, which you mentioned at the very beginning. That's why the UK welcomes the accession of the African Union into G20, and we're really looking forward to South Africa's G20 presidency and the opportunities and perspective that an African presidency is going to bring to these questions of representation too.
Okay, thanks.
Oh.
And Sarah Jane, I'd like to come to you next. So we've heard a kind of somewhat, well, challenging picture from the UN and from the IMF and from Anneliese that reform is afoot. Mm-hmm. How do you respond to what you're hearing? And I suppose particularly 1 year on from the Accra Marrakesh agenda, which is another ambitious set of proposals aimed at rewiring the financial system. Where do you see that we're at, and what needs to change?
Yeah, thank you for the question, and thank you as well for inviting me to the panel. We're in a situation where we have a multipolar world, global climate crisis, worsening debt burdens. We heard the persistent joblessness, cost of living crisis, all of this, all in one hit. And the Accra to Marrakesh agenda provides this vision of a reimagined global financial system, and it's great to see convergence of the Accra to Marrakesh agenda, the Antigua and Barbuda agenda, Bridgetown Initiative, SDG stimulus package, and Nairobi Declaration. I'd like to highlight 3 areas. 1 is representation, 2, making debt work for the climate, and 3, global public goods. So first, V20, voice and representation. We definitely need improvements in the World Bank and the IMF around this. It is critical to the IMF and World Bank's legitimacy. It's important for impact, and it's also vital when it comes to policy targets. The other thing to note is, barring a shareholder review, are there things we can do already to ensure that we can have more inclusive and balanced discussions? The answer to that is yes, absolutely. 1 is the V20 to be recognized as an intergovernment group in the World Bank and the IMF. That could be 1. The other point is that the World Bank and IMF do need to act with greater urgency, or greater sense of urgency, greater opportunity, but also additional capital. And the reality is, especially with this harsher reality imposed by climate change, it'll continue to outpace the rate of transformation required, and it'll render our institutional strategies and our toolkits pretty much obsolete. So if we look at the first pillar of the Accra to Marrakesh agenda, make debt work for the climate, debt to GDP ratios of 60% just doesn't necessarily make sense. We have Caribbean SIDS that have breached this threshold for over 30 years. And the World Bank uses income per capita as a way to reflect income status and access to concessionality, but it ignores multidimensional vulnerabilities. So we have countries that are locked out, we have middle income trap, and we're also accumulating unsustainable debt because we're paying for damages and recovery as a result of climate shocks fueled by the failure of developed countries to keep to 1.5 degrees limit as stipulated in the Paris Agreement. And so we have this debt that we accumulate after climate shocks, and that is our survival mechanism. It's not bad financial management, and I think that needs to be recognized somewhere relating to debt. The DSA, Marc is here, that needs to incorporate real climate and development investment needs, natural capital, which I know is challenging, and climate risks. And we really need to move away from austerity, given the growth potential of climate and development investments. Austerity measures are not inevitable. They are a deliberate fiscal choice, and the social consequences of this is profound. The creditor landscape is different. It's great to hear that the IMF is making progress on this because it's moving, well, we need the IMF to move quickly as well, and it must move faster than the cascading impacts that we see in our countries. I'll just reflect back to the Summit of the Future. The Deputy Prime Minister of Tuvalu mentioned, we will either drown in debt or be drowned by the sea. So this shows the intertwined crisis of crippling debt and the threats of climate change. And lastly, global public goods. I know that these discussions are taking place at the World Bank and the IMF, but we have no more wiggle room. There's really no time. We have to focus on this, and they need to make a leap, and I think they can. If we take the 2010s as an example, the World Bank reduced funding for CGIAR, which is an agriculture research consortium. Because of AI and because of new resources unlocked, perhaps they can go back to supporting some of these agriculture, technology, innovation, resilience-building efforts. And to close, G20 members, like the UK here, need to re-energize leadership around the IMF and the World Bank, where regaining and recovering opportunities to support the climate-vulnerable countries will require size, or revisiting their size and lending capacity, administrative efficiencies, improving the even-handedness, especially at the IMF, more inclusive discussions, and at the board level specifically, and more organized and explicit instruments for tackling debt, climate-fueled disasters, and global public goods. Otherwise, the relevance of these two institutions will continue to erode. Thanks.
And Claudio, GESTOS has worked with developing country governments to advocate for fairer treatment and better representation when it comes to global finance. What changes, similar question to you, what changes do you want to see within the multilateral space to change the power asymmetries in the global financial architecture?
Thank you for the question. Thank you to Venro for the invitation to be here and to the Hamburg Sustainability Conference to be here. I'm going to start, actually, the big change that needs to occur is in the political economy mindset, because that's what generates cognitive bias and bad decisions. Bad decisions accumulates over time, and when it accumulates over time, then you erode trust that you just talked about. And that's what's been happening with the international financial institutions. But the international financial institutions is just one part of the international financial architecture. So what we need to do in the international financial architecture is actually to unfold and to unpack what it means. Because reforming the international financial architecture means different things to different parties and to different institutions and to different people. So one of the things that we need to do, and actually 2 sessions before, we talked about tax. What we need to do in one way is actually we have to create a global progressive tax system. We do not have that. We have a global regressive tax system that facilitates concentration of capital through international and transnational monopolies and oligopolies. That undermines human rights, that undermines several other problems, particularly in the developing countries, but not only in developing countries, because austerity also occurs in developed countries. So a big change in the mindset would help on that. The other thing, credit rating agencies. We have pretty much an oligopoly of credit rating agencies with specific closed-down methodology. ECLAC actually proposed 3 years ago at the Financing for Development Forum a creation of a credit rating agency that will be under the auspices of the UN. It will be kind of a semi-public credit rating agency to counterbalance the oligopoly power of the current credit rating agencies that have a methodology that is still very much based on the 20th century. It does not consider the climate emergency. It does not consider the biodiversity problems. It does not consider all the human rights and the efforts that actually the countries need to do to develop. Another problem, GDP. We need to go beyond GDP. And I'm very happy that the Pact for the Future came out with a proposal that next year, in 1 year, we're going to have possibly a new index. That's going to be quite important, particularly for access to capital markets for the most vulnerable countries. But here's something that I would like to bring about is that when we talk about financing for development, we cannot talk only about the countries. We actually have to go down to the territories, to the ground. I'm going to give you a simple metaphor. financing for development, particularly sustainable development, it's not like a heart, which is a pump, just do one thing pumping. It's more like lungs, okay? If you think of the lungs, you can picture the lungs in your mind, but actually the lungs is composed of millions and millions of microalveoles that actually delivers the system and the whole process of converting the oxygen into something that we're going to live with. That's the same thing for financing. We need bigger and better banks, multilateral development banks and everything, but we need a framework that actually can bring that capital down to the territory, not only through a government, but actually by financing some of the agents that are implementing and are giving a lot of efforts to try to implement the SDGs on the ground, civil society organizations, community-based organizations, small and medium enterprises that have no access to competitive capital because of their vulnerability itself. That needs to change.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. I'd like to just... So just to pick up on Sarah Jane, your point there about incorporating climate and nature risk into DSAs, Marc, this I suppose is a question for you, but also touches on the credit ratings agency point that Claudio, you also raised. If we're to incorporate these risks into these kinds of frameworks, whether it's at the IMF or with credit ratings agencies, the situation for developing countries, or many developing countries, looks worse in the short term. So how, well, first of all, is this on the agenda to incorporate climate and nature into DSAs? And two, if that's the case, how can you make this work for the countries that are most in need?
So the answer is yes. It is at the center of our agenda on fixing our DSA frameworks. Climate is a very high priority for integration into our DSA frameworks. And I think it's a complicated issue. You rightly say, how do you bring it in a way that's, bring it into the frameworks in a way that's balanced? And we need to do four things. We need to be able to model correctly how climate affects economies over the long term, both in terms of a baseline and volatility. We need to model the impact of and understand the impact of adaptation and mitigation policies. We need to understand how financial markets might bring the impacts of climate forward, because their whole job is to price risk. And we need to understand how we measure risk in a long-term framework and understand the kind of risks that countries face. Now, we do very few of those right now. If you can do all of them, you'll have a balanced approach to assessing climate risk. One thing I want to point out, it might appear to be a small thing, but it's actually quite important. We do want to work on bringing into our DSAs a sort of opportunities test for countries. You know, we do all these stress tests about how events may increase the risk countries face, but we have a little asymmetry there because we don't actually assess fiscal space on the other side of the distribution, right? And by doing that, and doing it in the right way so that we can take into account the kind of climate financing packages or other long-term financing packages countries could draw on, we can have a better conversation about how to finance these things in a way that debt can remain sustainable. And we can better identify countries' specific financing needs and the kind of instruments that would help them to achieve the SDGs and in particular climate goals. So it is at the center of our work. We are working on it. It's not an easy thing to do, I will tell you. We can do it. I have to say, I hope our friends in the credit rating agencies will tackle this similarly. However, they often have the time frame associated with the interest of their clients, which is much shorter than what the IMF and World Bank can focus on. So I think we may have to lead the way on this, which we will do.
Thank you. Claudio, Sarah Jane, or anyone, in fact, would you like to respond at all to Marc's comments there?
Sure, yeah. So great to hear about the opportunities thing, because that's what's missing. We have so much growth opportunities that I think, if we make the investments this decade rather than next decade, it'll be cheaper. And having an institution like the IMF also support and verify this, like this is also quite important, that we verify this. It'll also help in terms of setting, planning opportunities, as well as build the case for climate finance to come in a lot sooner.
Yeah. Claudio?
I would add one interesting aspect, which following on the example of what the African group proposed on the tax convention framework that has been discussed at the UN, civil society organizations are maturing a proposal to actually establish a debt workout mechanism also under the auspices of the UN, just like a framework convention on debt. And that would bring the international financial institutions, the private creditors, the country creditors, and the recipient countries all together to discuss that, and it could resolve it and not just postpone the resolution.
Yeah, okay, thank you. And another topic that I wanted to address that comes up often in various policy white papers on this issue is carbon markets. And the V20 has been a supporter, I think so has the UN. Obviously, the UK government is a big proponent. But in the voluntary space, at least, and the carbon markets when it comes to climate finance, so as a mode to channel funds from wealthier countries to developing countries, many of which are rich in kind of the opportunity to remove or reduce carbon emissions from the atmosphere. But these markets have struggled to deliver both in terms of the climate gains as well as on the climate financing with the kind of intermediaries involved. So Anneliese, maybe, I don't know if you want to speak a bit about the UK government's efforts to build this market and how it can be done better to deliver on delivering finance to developing countries.
Yeah, I mean, we really do want to see an improvement in this area, both more effective carbon markets, but also ones that articulate better globally as well. You know, clearly this is a topic that's been progressing over very many years. I think we've really made a lot of progress around measurement. I remember when I was, many years ago, as a member of the European Parliament on the Economic and Monetary Affairs Committee. Back then, some of these issues then were in their infancy. You know, we are finally moving forward, but we're not yet at the stage where this is providing a robust enough framework to be driving resource allocation in many cases. You know, obviously the UK has now a relatively mature approach to this, but we want to be working with other countries on this. I think also another questions, if I may, around the, well, I've got the mic, sorry to abuse it, what I would call the skeleton, I suppose, to slightly abuse Claudio's metaphor about the body. For us, other mechanisms as well, like Just Energy Transition Partnerships, very important, because they can provide that long-term framework to hopefully, crowd in trust, investment, including from the private sector, as part of a partnership that isn't there just for one project. And of course, we know projects can be subject to legal challenge. There can be many, many issues that can develop, particularly for low-income countries. Instead, a partnership that's there for the long term. So a lot that needs to be done to provide that better framework so that we can ensure the investments there to drive economic development and action on the climate crisis.
Yeah, thank you. And so these Just Energy Transition Partnerships, they're about retiring coal assets early, getting the financing in line for that and replacing them with renewable energy. There's some in you've just been to Indonesia to assess progress on the JETP there. Colombia just announced a kind of similar framework that it's adopting. But progress has been really slow. I think it was COP26 possibly when they were first announced. And we haven't seen any kind of on the ground progress in terms of retiring these coal plants. And obviously the clock is ticking. So what can you do, what can the UK government do to advance progress in that space?
Yeah, I mean, we're really determined to seek to do what we can to revitalise these mechanisms. I mean, if we didn't have JETPs, we would have to invent them. We would need to have a mechanism so that, as I said, we can build that trust, we can have a long-term partnership to provide that support towards decarbonisation. And these are not easy questions. I mean, I come from an oil and gas producing region within my own country. Most of my family work in oil and gas. These are long-term, difficult questions, and particularly for countries that have not experienced economic development before. They're very challenging, but we need to be working together. And for the new UK government, we want to be working together in equal partnership, and a partnership that's there for the long term. And that's why we're seeking to really revitalise that leadership, as I said before.
Yeah. Okay. We've got a few minutes left, so I just wanted to see if there's any questions. I think we have an intervention from the floor. Yes. I think, could we get a mic? Thank you. Please go ahead. If you could just introduce yourself as well.
Yes, thank you. I'm Mónica Colomera. I'm from the Spain's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Development. Thank you very much for this very rich and interesting panel. As you know, for Spain, that we will host next year in Sevilla the 4th International Financing Conference on Financing for Development. It is an honor, but it's a responsibility that we share with our countries and stakeholders. And we think that as United Nations Under Secretary mentioned, this is a milestone to deliver, to make progress toward a just and fair international financing architecture. And bearing in mind this goal, we have to start identifying some ideas, specific Asian opportunities, as Sara was mentioning, and also Claudio. And in this context, we have seen some potential on special drawing rights. Spain has committed to reallocating 50% of the 2021 allocation. And I wanted to ask the panel on the potential role of the SDRs to strengthen the financial safety net. Thank you very much.
Marc, I think that's one for you.
Well, I have to punt this to our membership because it's our membership that would determine whether SDRs would be raised further. Now, we can they can be raised further in theory, obviously, but there are some issues in rechanneling them because it's not a pure form of liquidity. There are debit and credit accounts involved at the IMF. So it can be helpful, but it's not a substitute for actual ODA from donors in grants. So I do want to emphasize that. But yes, I would punt to our membership on that question.
Anneliese?
Very happy to respond. I mean, we are supportive of international efforts to explore viable options for channeling SDRs through MDBs, multilateral development banks. Of course, they have to be viable, and we recognise that this it will be fulfilling a particular niche if it is possible to deliver. But we have been supportive of this, as the UK, and we have made substantial contribution through channeling IMF special drawing rights. In 2023, that amounted to £5.3 billion of support. So, yes, we think that scope for innovation is one that we need to be working on together. And we would agree, we've got to be clear about what could be delivered, but also what can't be. And this is part of that broader ecology of efforts that we're all going to be delighted to be talking about and hopefully agreeing on in Sevilla next year.
Yeah, Sara.
Just to flag, there was a CVF Leaders Declaration in the UN General Assembly, and there was a clear call for new climate SDRs. The RST has huge demand, as the IMF knows, and that needs more money, like more SDRs. And so I think that must be part of the toolkit. And so another call should happen hopefully before the decade ends. The other point is just on the just transition. We do have an example of a coal plant that is closing early in the Philippines, purely private sector, purely on a cost of capital basis. But the point is local actors, domestic actors, and the ecosystem is quite critical for successful energy transition partnerships, and we see one purely private in the Philippines.
Yeah, the Philippines has been a great case study, as you said, with very specific dimensions, and so now it's going to be about replicating that or replicating it to the local specificities elsewhere. Anneliese, I just wanted to come back. Sorry, Lee, did you want to?
Oh yeah, just wanted to add a few more words about the Sevilla conference. Certainly, UN supports this rechanneling of the SDRs, and also we want to see that the fund in the coming months could also discuss or explore the options to ensure to issue the more SDRs as needed. But in addition to that, we also hope that for the Sevilla conference, we could harvest at least of some lower hanging fruits in addition to this SDR rechanneling, like the tax, international tax cooperation, because we need to meet or to match expectations by the global south. I'll stop here.
Yeah, okay. Well, I think we have, yes, over here.
Thank you so much. Min Tu Pham, CEO of Project Starling and a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Thank you so much for this fabulous panel and for all of your very just excellent comments. My question is about the title of this, Towards a Just and Fair International Financial Architecture. I know Mr. Lee has already addressed this, but I'd love the other 4 panelists to tell us what you think a fair and just international financial architecture is.
Okay, and that in 25 seconds.
Okay, I'll start.
yeah.
Progressive taxation, national progressive taxation, global progressive taxation, and an international framework, legal framework to actually expand taxation beyond the national boundaries.
Yeah, okay, possibly one per person, so Mark.
Well, look, you know, we're not the IMF is composed of its members. The IMF is an institution set up to deliver on its members' wishes. So, you know, there are a lot of different ways you could characterize a just and fair architecture. In the end, the IMF will have the view of the consensus of its membership on this point, of how they want to take it. So I may have personal views, but
Okay, yeah. So Anneliese, as a member.
Oh goodness, the gong is sounded. I mean, we would say that actually delivers what it's meant to deliver, that lives up to its values. And, you know, those have been clear for a long time, but we always need to make sure that they are genuinely being promoted. That means, in particular, not entrenching inequalities through operation, but actually combating them. But then also being part of that broader overall architecture, not just of the MDBs of the IMF, also around taxation, for example, making sure that there is more inclusive OECD process, also making sure other forms of domestic resource mobilization are there too.
Okay, Sarah Jane, quickly. Just
Voice and representation of climate vulnerable countries across all international institutions.
and Lee.
Well, as a set of the additional resources mobilization, that's the key for the Global South.
Okay, well, I think we'll end it there. Thanks very much, everybody, for joining us, and thank you for listening today.